Question from Bob. Had a nice conversation with a gentleman in a parking lot who, after I asked him if he knew Jesus, said yes and no. After further discussion, during which I was talking about Jesus' death and resurrection on the cross because of his great love for us, I asked him how he felt about that and what did he think. He then said that he was a Muslim and they do not believe it was Jesus who died, but someone who was sent from heaven in his place. I do not remember ever hearing this. The conversation was extremely pleasant, but comments.
Well, there's one of two possibilities there. He's lying or was lied to, because that's not even Islamic. The idea of the substitution theory, of what it's usually called, the mistaken identity theory. Some people say that it was a mistaken Thomas, who was called the twin, who was crucified in Jesus' place, which even a cursory reading of history, atheists like Tübingen and Wellhausen, the Strauss critique, I think it was called, written in the 19th century against Christianity, he acknowledged that the idea of someone other than Jesus being crucified is completely out of the question historically. And ironically enough, it's the biggest challenge that Islam has to deal with because it's a blatant historical error. You don't have to be a Christian to admit that Jesus physically died. There's atheists like John Dominic Crossan, Bart Ehrman, James D.Z. Dunn, and others, devout and avowed atheists who would say that the most certain fact of ancient history is that Jesus was crucified under orders of Pontius Pilate and so forth. So when a Muslim is presented with that and their Quran is supposedly not just their source of spiritual information, but literally Allah on this earth, it's the word of Allah which emanates from him eternally. It shares his attributes, which we can talk about in another time. They have to contend with this because I understand, and they would understand, an illiterate 7th century caravan robber and pedophile getting something wrong about basic Christianity. But I wouldn't expect the creator of the universe to not know whether or not Jesus was crucified. So how do they reconcile this? They say it was divine intervention. And they get this from Surah 5 in verse 157. This states, and this is directly from the Arabic, and they're saying, surely we killed the Christ, Isa, son of Mary, the messenger of Allah, and they did not kill him, and they did not salaba him. That's usually understood to being crucified. The problem is it's Persian in origin, so much for the idea of the Quran being pure Arabic. But it was made to appear to them. That's what they focus on. And surely those who disagree about him are in doubt of him. They do not have any knowledge of him except following the conjecture. They did not kill him for certain. Yet Allah raised him up to himself, and Allah was dear wise. So when it comes to the death of Jesus, they have a prescribed loyalty to their doctrine. They say that the Quran is free from error. Or at least, according to the Quran, if it was from any other than Allah, it wouldn't contain much error. Whatever that means. But the idea is that they make a historical claim that can be shown as false, both from Christians and non-Christians. Hindus can make this argument, Zoroastrians can make this argument, Catholics, Mormons, you name it. Anyone could level this challenge against the Muslim faith because it makes an error in history. So their loyalty would have them say, and this individual, I guess, just made something up, that Allah sent down someone in his place. Well, it doesn't say that Allah sent down anyone to replace Jesus on the cross.
Right.
It says that after, or perhaps during, we aren't sure, Allah raised Isa, the name for Jesus, up to himself. Now, what's interesting to note is that they did not kill him. And because Muslims end up getting tied in so many knots over this issue, they're even now, you can look up the, I'm trying to remember which school he's studying under, but Sheikh Yasser Qadi, he was basically making concessions on this point and saying, well, it says that he wasn't killed, but maybe what the emphasis is, not that it was made to appear to them, but what we're missing is, this is one interpretation, that when they thought they killed them, it was actually Allah who caused him to die, because other Quranic passages note Jesus and John the Baptist saying, "Blessed am I the day I was born, the day I die, and the day I rise from the dead."
Right.
And they would note this as a future resurrection. I don't really have much of a problem with that. But the point that they have to drive home, or at least that the ones trying to handwave over this drive home, is so it was made to appear to them. So by divine intervention, someone looked like Jesus during a full Roman crucifixion, which means that they showed the signs of the half-death. Julius Caesar called it the flogging. If you've seen Passion of the Christ, that was censored. The point being made is this: Allah did such a good job tricking everybody, and that's why one of Allah's 99 names is Al-Makr, literally the best of deceivers. And you can read about this in Surah 354 and 830, as well as 5 other places. But the title of Allah is the best of deceivers. And he was so effective in his deception that he convinced the Jews, according to this passage, who would claim that they crucified the Christ.
That's what the passage says.
Already do we see a problem there. Why was Jesus being crucified? Not because they claimed he was the Christ, because he was claiming to be the Christ and they didn't believe him. They wouldn't refer to him as a title they didn't believe him to be. First historical error. Actually third, but we'll deal with that more. The second issue is that as they're dealing with this issue, we killed Christ, the Son of Mary, right? What was the whole drive of this event? That no one would have the victory over one of Allah's messengers. Well, if you're going to argue that, how did Muhammad die? A Jewish woman whose family Muhammad slaughtered poisoned him, and he ended up suffering as a result of not knowing that you don't want to accept a cooked lamb from the woman whose family you just slaughtered, and he ended up suffering horrible agony for the next 2 years of his life. And Aisha herself said, "I never saw anyone suffer more pain than the messenger of Allah," and said that this is the time that it cuts off my aorta, feeling the poison that I ate, speaking to the mother of the guy who died there, of what I ate with your son at Khaybar. So what's interesting about all of these events is every single argument they try to use to excuse this, it was to protect Jesus. Why? Because Allah's not going to allow his messengers to be killed in such a humiliating way. Your greatest prophet died a humiliating and painful death. Why protect Jesus? Well, it was made to appear to them. Well, that's just noting the point that Allah tricked them. He deceived them. You believe that a God deceives people. Not that he has a positive attribute of twisting the truth, that he has a negative aspect of his character against truth. We believe that God cannot lie. That's in the Bible. The God of Islam is a deceiver by nature. That's one of his names. When we call our God our banner, we're calling him our protection in battle. When we call him our healer, our provider, these are things that he does because of who he is. A belief in a God that's an omnipotent deceiver, how do you know that Islam is true? How do you know that he hasn't revealed these things to you just because he's trying to deceive you? And this is why Muslims end up so desperate when they take their religion seriously, because one of Muhammad's companions, one of the rightly guided caliphs, Abu Bakr, said, "If I had 1 foot in paradise, I would still fear Allah's deception." And that's the point. So if Allah tricks people so effectively, not only the implications of that, but what were the consequences of that? He looked like he died, and then apparently, according to history, appeared alive again to his disciples. Now, as Christians, we would agree with that. The Muslims would maybe hand wave or just say, well, that's why he could appear to his disciples, because he never died, right?
Right.
Well, here's the problem with that. If the disciples saw Jesus alive after his death, according to 1 Corinthians 15, 3-7, that's what started Christianity. The largest false religion in history, according to Islam. We are going to hell, according to the Quran, because we associate partners, the sin of shirk, with Allah. According to the Quran, apparently, we believe that Jesus and Mary are 2 gods besides Allah. Any Christian ever believed that in history? Anyone? No.
That Mary and Jesus are
2 gods apart from Allah?
Yeah.
That's the weakest attempt at defining the Trinity I've ever heard, but that's what the God of Islam thinks. Once again, I understand how a caravan robber and pedophile wouldn't know that, but it is embarrassing for them to have to deal with this in their sacred book. So what do? Like the individual you talked with, Bob, as polite as he was lying to you, or he was lied to, because their book would not only disagree with that, but the implications of that show that Allah created Christianity by accident. Or, in the case of Surah 5 and verse 34, Surah 3 verse 54, he tricked them and deceived them because reasons. Allah knows best. Ahl Kitab, I suppose. But understand why this is such a serious issue to not only see these people in the lens of, but to genuinely desire their salvation from. Because according to the revelation of Jesus Christ in history, who God truly is, who's the best of deceivers? Who would rightfully claim that title as a liar from the beginning?
Serpent.
The devil,
Enemy,
Yeah.
Iblis in their tongue. And yet they attribute those aspects to their God. Imagine living with that and understanding the implications of it. And imagine as well living out those virtues as if it's something good in your life, which is what you see all of these protests being organized, regardless of what's the truth. Allah's a deceiver. I model his character in my life by lying. Muhammad himself said in the Sahih al-Bukhari that war is deceit, that the kinds of lies that are permitted is in the context of war, which all Muslims are in a perpetual state of war against the non-believers till they are all Muslim. You can read that in Sahih Muslim. If you're trying to appease your wife, and if you find something better, according to Surah 33. So here's the point. In Surah 5, 157, you have the probably second biggest blunder in all of Quranic doctrine, which is why Muslims are put in an intentional state of ignorance by the majority of their spiritual leaders. If you encounter someone who hasn't read their Quran or is simply parroting to you people they trust to give them the truth about what Allah's word has revealed to them, then you could at least pity them and say, well, I guess I have to convert you to Islam first before I talk you out of it, because what you're believing isn't what your book says. But if, on the other hand, they are purposefully lying to you, it doesn't matter how polite they are, they're manipulating you, and that's not cool. But here's the point, and just to recap this. When the Quran makes a claim that Jesus never died, anyone could hold the Quran's feet to the fire on that point and say, that's false. We could know more than anything else in history that Jesus of Nazareth was killed. If you say, well, it was a supernatural event, then Allah created Christianity by accident or intentionally, which is worse. And according to your Quran, that would fit with his character. Why do you follow a deceiver? That's the nature of Satan, not God. And if you say, well, what if he sent someone down spiritually? Now you're under a death penalty in Islam for the sin of bid'ah, of innovation, because you're adding to things that Allah hasn't revealed. So this is not the kind of situation that any Muslim would want to get themselves in. Yet of the 5, maybe 7 things that a Muslim is trained to talk to Christians about, that's probably number 2 on the list. Now, if you want to talk about the number 1 issue, feel free to ask at a future time, but understand this is number 2. This is way up there as far as the sort of things that you need to challenge Muslims on, because they need to hear the gospel. They need to know a God who isn't a liar. They need to know a God who doesn't basically depend on the ignorance of some monster from the 7th century. That's why we love these people, because we want to see them taken out of this death cult.
Okay.
Yeah, a lot of good stuff there, Sean. I'm going to kind of give a little bit of an anecdotal kind of story here, and hopefully it kind of helps out of how maybe you can approach this too, Bob. I remember when I first started reading the Bible, I went to high school and started sharing with people about what I was reading. Now, I started the Bible from the book of Genesis on. So when I got to some of the rawer parts of the Bible, which is a lot of parts, by the way, that have a lot of really raw sections of it, I was so excited. I went to my high school and I was like, check this out, finding Christians and hey, did you read about this? Did you read about this? And man, and I remember a lot of Christians were like, that's not in the Bible, or I never read that before, and I don't think you're reading the right thing, Bo. And I was really kind of blown away by that. I remember thinking man, am I really reading the right book? And I'd go back home and I'd open it up and it said Genesis, and I went, oh, yeah, I'm reading the right thing. But it really hit me that that a lot of Christians just don't know the Bible, and they just have never read the Bible, and so they're not familiar with it. And that's, I'm sure, with a lot of Muslims as well. You know,
Right.
where just because a Muslim says to you, hey, we don't believe that Jesus died on the cross, we believe that Allah exchanged the person. The best thing to say is, where is that?
Right.
Where are you getting that in the Quran or in your writings?
Yeah.
You know, can you show me where that's at? Because when you read the passage that kind of conveys this very vague kind of deception, if you read the context of that section of the Quran, it is a rant against the Jews. It is a gigantic, Jews, you haven't listened to Allah, and you haven't done this, and you haven't done that, and blah, 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 and you worship idols, and it's just this giant rant.
Yeah.
And so it's a real knock on the Jews, you know, kind of like, you know, and it's kind of like, you can't get over on Allah. Allah will win, you know, kind of in the end, you know. But I guess the point that I'm saying is that a lot of probably Muslims have never read that section of the Quran and
Very
don't
rarely.
really know it that well. And they probably don't know the other sections that talk about Jesus and his dying as well.
Yeah.
And so there's all these interpretations of the Quran, but that's because in Islamic theology, there is no really redemption. There's no redemption theology. Christianity is used to a redeeming theology, right?
Yeah.
We have a God who redeems us. We have a God who buys us out of slavery. He purchases our salvation for us. We don't have to earn our salvation. It's something that God does. Him be the glory. You know, so our salvation isn't on us. It's not our glory, but it's his glory.
Yeah.
He is the author and finisher of our faith. And so that's the idea that Islam, it's not there in Islam. They don't have a redemption story. And so for them, as Sean was saying, salvation is something that is, it's not secure.
Right.
And so the way they've interpreted the Quran is to fit this idea of not having a redemption story, you know, and they're trying to make it cohesive, to which there's not much cohesiveness in the Quran.
Right.
And so in a sense, they're doing their best to try to make things fit.
Yeah.
But instead, they just make things more confusing.
Right.
And so I would say you just ask people like, hey, let's look at those Quran passages, and let's look at all the passages that talk about Jesus, and let's kind of look into it.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
and see if they kind of get a more eye-opening view than maybe what they've been told.
Right. Yeah. And as you related it, I mean, it's the same really for any, you know, even Christians who maybe don't, you know what the word says, and we kind of do that for each other, like, oh, I'm going to do this. Well, where is that?
Yeah.
Let's see what the word says about that,
Yeah.
you know.
Yeah,
I
it's
mean-
like a Christian who says, "Oh, I don't believe in the Old Testament. I believe in the New Testament."
Yeah.
You hear that all the time
Yeah.
in Christianity,
Yeah.
right?
Like,
And you're
yeah.
like, "What?" And you're like, "Whoa."
Read the
that's-
first verse of the New Testament. Who's Abraham? Who's David? Why is that
Right.
important?
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah, but
Who did Jesus quote?
yeah, there's no, you
What did
know,
Jesus quote? Yeah.
again, it's just, this person probably is like many Christians. They just have never read the passage.
Right.
You
Yeah,
know.
makes sense. Well, Bob, thank you. Hope that helps you out. Thanks for your question today and being part of the show.